Now for our first task, we have to configure domain and local user password policy settings. And I'm over here on our server file1.company.pri only because I want to show you for local users where these password policy settings get configured. If I hit the start button here and type in local security, that will bring up the local security policy link here so that we can take a look at local security policy for this machine. Now, again, back in 410, the 410 content, we explored this just a bit. So this is kind of rehash if you were with me when we were going through that 410 content. But the only thing I want to show you is that down here under account policies is the password policy right here, where you can configure a couple of different settings associated with passwords and how often they need to be changed. There's a similar item down here for the lockout policy. These are the account lockout durations and thresholds. I'll explore all of these here in just a second. But I just want to show you this here because this is the location where you configure these settings for the local users on these machines. What I think is far more important for our exploration today is not here for the local policies, but is instead over here on the domain, our domain controller, and how we would configure these globally using a group policy object. Now, I know we have an entire course coming up on group policy, and we already explored group policy also in the 70-410 content. But let's actually sort of pretend for a minute like we know everything we need to know about the application of GPOs so that we can explore very specifically where these GPOs can be configured to define our password policy settings. Now, the one big thing you have to know here, and this just seems like it makes an awesome test question, is a very unique use case as it comes to these password policy settings. In most situations, and in fact, in just about every other situation, a configuration that you make here in group policy can be done to really any GPO. But there's one area where that's different, and that has to do with password policy settings and everything we'll be talking about here in this objective and module. For the password policy settings, the only GPO where you can configure them where they will apply is the default domain policy. So keep that in your brain, that default domain is the location where you want to configure these. Now in default domain, you'll see if we come down here to policies and Windows settings, we can see right here the security settings and then account policies that are associated with this GPO. You will see this in any GPO that you create. However, you'll only be able to configure it in this GPO to have it apply to the domain. So just again, keep that in your mind. We have three different items that we need to explore here. The first of which is just the password policy right up here at the top. And it's here I want to talk just a minute about just these different settings, the 6 you see here, and how you might configure them, at least how they're done most often in the variety of different Active Directory environments that are out there. The first of which is this enforce password history, which just simply says we are going to remember the last 24 passwords that a person has entered in. Setting this to a very high number prevents a user from reusing a password over and over again. And that can be a good thing for your security posture because you just don't want users kind of spoofing around their need to reset passwords by just cycling through them over and over again. Now, arguably the most important of these settings, and the one that probably causes the most consternation in every Active Directory environment, is this one right here for maximum password age. By default, the maximum password age for a domain is 42 days. And you should be aware that any passwords where the password never expires parameter is checked inside of Active Directory users and computers will ignore this setting. But for all the other accounts, a user would need to change their password every 42 days. You can adjust this to a different number. You commonly see this anywhere from 30 to 90, sometimes even more days between password changes. But a lot of times this is defined by your security policy or whatever regulation you're responsible for fulfilling. What is perhaps a little more complicated or misunderstood is the minimum password age down here, which is set to 1 day. Now the point here is to protect Active Directory and your user accounts from a user that attempts to just reset the password over and over again until they meet that 24 password limit. The idea being here that once a person changes a password, well, then they're unable to go about changing that password again until a 24-hour period has elapsed. This protects you again from a user purposely cycling through passwords so that they can keep the same one even as you're applying these maximum password ages. Another one here is the minimum password length. You can set this to a certain number of characters, again, typically based on your security policy. Also down here is where your password must meet the complexity requirements. Now, turning this on, which it is by default, ensures that a password that a person uses has to meet the following requirements. It cannot contain the user's account name or parts of their full name that exceed 2 consecutive characters. It has to be at least 6 characters in length. It also must contain characters from 3 of the 4 categories, like lowercase characters, uppercase characters, digits, and then special characters like exclamation points and dollar signs and so on. This is another enabled by default setting. This just ensures that users aren't typing in, a series of lowercase letters as their password, in the hopes that that would create a much better password for that user, a much less hackable password for that user. Now, commonly you'll see these configured in such a way so that the password complexity requirements are enabled. But these days, there's a lot of back and forth in the scientific community, as it were, for what the best approach might be for passwords. Passwords these days, they're recognized to be known that the longer the password is, the more challenging it is to hack or to decrypt. And so extending your minimum password length to a much longer set of characters can actually be something that may be useful to you. A lot of admins aren't aware that Windows itself can support the spacebar as a password character. So it's entirely possible for a user to use a passphrase as opposed to a password. All of these, again, depend on what your security and regulatory requirements are because, let's face it, those requirements may not be as up-to-date with the science in terms of what can and can't be decrypted. Now, the most important of these is the last one down here. Store passwords using reversible encryption. Do not enable this. The only time you would need to enable this is in the very rare circumstance where you have an NT40 type application, very old application that for some reason requires it. And even if then, it's a good idea to segregate out that application into its own domain. Storing passwords using reversible encryption provides a way to reverse the encryption on the password. And so keeping this disabled is a really good idea from a security perspective.